Hi, my name is Eric, and this is a presentation about exposure. What is an exposure? An exposure happens when light in the form of an image hits a light-sensitive medium such as film, digital sensor, or photographic paper. A proper exposure involves having the correct amount of light striking the medium. Too little light produces an underexposure, too much light an overexposure. So here are three examples. An overexposure happens when there is too much light energy hitting the sensor. An underexposure, there is too little light. What you want is just the right amount of light to produce a proper exposure. So what makes the right amount of light? Well, a proper exposure occurs when the correct amount of light hits a camera sensor. There are three components to produce this exposure. The amount of light coming in. That's partly based upon the amount of light that there is, but it's also controlled by the aperture of the lens. Aperture is measured in f-stops, so f2.8, f8, f22 are examples. The second parameter is the time of the exposure. That's how long. This is controlled by shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in seconds, so 1/500th, 1/15th, or 4 seconds. And finally, the sensitivity of the media to light. It's controlled by the camera's ISO settings. So what is an aperture? Well, an aperture is a hole in the lens, analogous to the pupil of your eye. It can open up, let more light in, or close down, let less light in much the same way that your eye does. The metal ring which creates the aperture is called the diaphragm. It is built into the lens. It is analogous to the iris of the eye. Most diaphragms are made of between 5 to 9 thin metal blades that slide past each other. Aperture size is measured in f numbers. Okay, so the simple version on that is that aperture controls how much light comes into the camera. The thing to remember, though, is that aperture also controls depth of field. So a wide open aperture like f2.8, which lets lots of light in the camera, also produces a very thin depth of field, so you get an out of focus background, for example. A very small aperture like f11 lets very little light into the camera, but it produces a large depth of field. So shutter speed was the second parameter. What exactly is a shutter? The shutter is the mechanism which allows a camera to time an exposure. It can be a mechanical device or an electronic device. Cameras with mechanical devices have to be large enough to allow the device to fit inside the housing. That's why DSLRs are so big. Whether mechanical or electronic, the shutter is what makes shutter speed possible. So the simple version on that has to do with what happens with shutter speed. So a very fast shutter speed, like 1/60th of a second, 1/160th, it will freeze action to some extent, as opposed to a very long shutter speed, like 15 seconds, will allow action to be blurred. So you can control how much blur is in the exposure by controlling the length of time for the shutter speed. Now, before we go further, we have to understand how they work together. And to do that, we need to talk about what a stop is. So a stop is simply a halving or doubling of light. Shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of seconds. So 2 seconds is twice as fast as 1 second. There's one stop difference between the two. The same is true for a quarter and an eighth of a second. If you need to pause this to take a look at this and examine it closer, do it, and then we'll continue. So stops work the same way with aperture, but the progression is less intuitive. Okay, apertures are measured in f values. f2 lets in twice as much light as f2.8, and f16 lets in half as much as f11. The numbers are based on logarithms instead of simple multiplying, so the numbers aren't as intuitive as shutter speeds were. Again, if you need to pause this to take a look at the number line, it might help. Okay, aperture and shutter speed work together to create the exposure. The trick is to find the right balance to get the shot that you want. Okay, now this is really a very important point here, so this is something that I really want you to pay attention to. Slow shutter speed causes blur. It lets lots of light on the sensor, but if anything moves, it's going to be blurry. A long shutter speed can be desirable in certain situations, like moving water or fireworks, and there's lots of other examples. An aperture lets you control how much depth of field there is. Sometimes a wide open aperture gives you very little depth of field, and that allows the background to be blurred. As opposed to a very small aperture gives you all kinds of depth of field, which allows great scenic shots, for example. Now, this is also important. I got two pictures here. The one on the left was taken at f/22 at 2 seconds, and there's that idea of the blurring water again. Okay, small, tiny little aperture, long shutter speed, so good depth of field, and a long shutter speed to get blur. The one on the right was shot at f/2.8 at 1/15 of a second. Now what's interesting is that both of these exposures let the exact same amount of light on the sensor. Okay, and so if you look at the table in the middle, it gives you a series of different possible exposures, all of them leaving the exact same amount of light on the sensor. The difference is in how much depth of field and how much blur there is, and you can control those two things by playing with that table. Now, exposure settings and aperture and ISO are given for a number of these photographs, and if you want to pause them just to read, go ahead. I'm just going to go through them fairly quickly. Each of these photographs was set and taken with particular parameters because there's this idea of controlling depth of field and controlling amount of movement, blur from movement. Sometimes tripods were used, certainly some long lenses, and some wides and some ultra wides. Now, what I've given here is a workflow on how to figure out aperture and shutter speed. And what's really important on this, and I'm going to suggest that you try using aperture priority, is the first step is to determine what's the most important shooting factor. Is it shutter speed or aperture? So if it's shutter speed, I've given you a series of things to consider. If it's aperture, I've given you another group of things to consider. And basically you come up with two different possible scenarios. You're either going to have, on aperture priority, a wide open aperture, or you're going to have a fairly small aperture. Now there are certainly in between values, but it's not uncommon to pick values that are fairly close to either end. And always remember to start with an ISO of 100. And if you find that your shutter speeds are really slow, bump your ISO up so that you can get better shooting speeds. These are examples of using the flowchart. Okay, so in this one here, depth of field was important. Time wasn't a problem because I had a tripod. So I set it up, figured out what my settings should be, and took my picture. Here I'm shooting wildlife, long lens, very important to have a fairly fast shutter speed. Depth of field usually isn't an issue, and to facilitate shutter speed, you're typically going to shoot wide open, which at this place was f6.3. Most of my bird photographs that I do, and many of my wildlife ones, are all done wide open because it's the only way to go. When I'm shooting landscapes, typically I want lots of depth of field, so I'm shooting with a very small aperture. That's going to give me slow shutter speeds, and on days with good light, it's usually not an issue. With bad light, I may have to bump up my ISO or maybe use a tripod. Shooting people, especially kids, again, fast shutter speed. Shooting indoors without flash, and I want to emphasize this is without flash. It's not unusual to bump up an ISO. In this particular case, I've got using a 50mm f1.4, which lets in a tremendous amount of light. It also gives really nice out of focus backgrounds. Thanks so much for watching, and I do appreciate you taking the time to look at this. And I've got lots of other shows, presentations. Please have a look at them too. Thanks so much.